Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 30th of November 2018 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on the screen. The timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular article appears as an editorial on page number 8. The title of the article is Cool It. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 3 environment under the subsection environmental conservation. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the prestigious and the world famous medical journal known as the Lancet has recently published a report known as the Countdown 2018. And this particular report basically focuses on understanding the linkages between the health and the climate change. That is to say, it seeks to understand the adverse health effects which may be caused due to the climate change. And accordingly, it has given certain suggestions to the Indian government to address these health challenges which may take place due to the growing climate change. So as part of this video analysis, we shall basically focus on the three aspects. Firstly, we'll understand the adverse health effects which may be caused due to the climate change as highlighted in this particular report. Secondly, we will look into what should be the India's response in order to address these adverse health effects. And thirdly, this particular article here highlights that India has to pressurize the global community to enhance its funding for the climate change. So accordingly, as part of our video analysis, we will look into certain global funds which have been set up to address the problem of climate change. So let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. Now coming to the first aspect of the article as to what would be the adverse health impact of the climate change. Now the Countdown 2018 report published by the Lancet has stated that the climate change would be the biggest health challenge of the 21st century. And this is on account of number of reasons such as the climate change would lead to the premature deaths of the people, it would lead to increase in the vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue, it would decrease the labor capacity, particularly that of the agriculture workers, and it would also adversely affect the food production, leading to food insecurity. So it is on account of these four reasons, the report has stated that the climate change would be the biggest health challenge of the 21st century. Further, this particular report highlights that due to the increase in the temperature due to the climate change, there has been increase in the frequency, duration as well as the intensity of the heat waves in India. And as you can see in this particular graph, the heat waves exposure in India has drastically increased from the year 2000 onwards. And this increase in the frequency, duration and intensity of the heat waves in India has led to adverse health effects. And these adverse health effects include increased death of the people due to heat stroke, the higher probability of the heart failure. Further, due to the growing heat waves, there is a greater probability of people getting dehydrated, and this may have an adverse effect on the functioning of kidney. So these are some of the adverse health effects which may take place due to the increase in the frequency, duration and intensity of the heat waves in India. Further, this particular report has also highlighted that the climate change would have an adverse impact on the number of working hours as well as the labor capacity. And accordingly, it has stated that across the world, approximately 153 billion hours of labor were lost in the year 2017. And when it comes to India, approximately 70,000 million hours were lost due to the climate change in 2017. And this particular graph here highlights the total number of hours lost by each sector of the Indian economy. And as clearly highlighted here, the maximum impact has been on the agriculture sector, where the agriculture sector has lost around 60,000 million hours. And this maximum impact on the agriculture sector is considered to be quite significant for the Indian economy because 49% of its workforce is employed in the agriculture sector. So the decrease in the labor capacity of the agriculture sector would have an adverse impact on the household income in the rural areas of India. Further, according to a recent report published by the World Bank, these adverse health impacts would lead to erosion of India's GDP by 2.8% by the end of 2050. So because of this, one can clearly say that The climate change would impose a very high socio-economic cost on the Indian economy. So these are some of the aspects which one should know. Let us now look at the suggestions given by the report in order to combat these adverse health impacts. Now, as we have discussed, there has been increase in the frequency, intensity and duration of heat waves. So this particular report has suggested that in order to reduce the adverse impact of the heat waves, the government should have to identify the heat spots in India, and such a identification has to take place through the tracking of the meteorological data, which means that the government has to prepare a map of those areas in India which are more prone to the heat waves. And once a map is prepared, the government has to promote the development of the local heat action plans. And as we have discussed, the climate change has led to the decrease in the number of working hours as well as the labor capacity. So, in order to reduce the adverse impact of the climate change, this particular report has highlighted that the government should undertake review of the occupational health standards of the various industries, and the government should also regulate the safety of the workers by keeping in mind its relation to the climate. Further, in order to address the increased death of the people due to the air pollution, this particular report has suggested that the government should cut down the carbon emissions. Further, the government should also give a greater push for the environment friendly, the renewable energy projects such as the solar energy. Further, as you know, there has been increase in the frequency of the adverse weather events in India, such as the recent Kerala floods as well as the havoc which has been caused because of the cyclone Gaja. So, in order to handle these adverse weather events, this particular report has suggested that the Indian government should be well prepared in order to adapt to such events. Further, it has also stated that the Indian government has to pressurize the global community as well as international organizations such as the UNFCCC to release more funds to combat these adverse weather events. And this becomes extremely important for the developing and low income countries because almost 90% of the losses suffered by these countries due to these adverse weather events is not insured. Hence, it is in this particular regard, this particular article has suggested that the Indian government has to influence the global community to release more funds. So, these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to the second part of the article. Let us now look at some of the global funds which have been set up in order to combat the problem of climate change. Now, the most important fund which has been set up to address the problem of the climate change is the Green Climate Fund. This particular fund has been established under the framework of the UNFCCC. Hence, this particular fund acts as a financial mechanism of the UNFCCC convention. And this fund has been set up in order to support the projects in the developing countries in order to adapt and mitigate the impact of climate change. This fund provides for the financing of projects related to the adaptation, that is, the projects which would lead to the adaptation of to the climate change, as well as the mitigation, that is, those projects which would lead to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And the most important aspect which you should know with respect to this particular fund is that it gives equal emphasis on both adaptation projects as well as the mitigation projects, where 50% of the funds shall be allocated for the adaptation projects and the remaining 50% for the mitigation projects. Further, the UNFCCC has set a target of raising around $100 billion by the end of 2020 under this fund. The second important fund is the Adaptation Fund. This particular fund has been set up under the Kyoto Protocol. As you know, the Kyoto Protocol provides for the clean development mechanism. So this particular fund is mainly raised through the proceeds of the clean development mechanism. And this fund is mainly used to finance the adaptation projects in the developing countries. So one important difference between the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund is that the Green Climate Fund focuses on both adaptation projects as well as the mitigation projects. On the other hand, the Adaptation Fund mainly focuses on the adaptation projects. The next fund is the LDC fund, that is Least Developed Countries Fund. This particular fund has been established under the UNFCCC, and this fund is mainly set up in order to assist the least developed countries in order to implement their national adaptation program for action. And the next fund is known as the Special Climate Change Fund. This particular fund has been set up under the Global Environment Facility. Under this fund, the finances are given to the developing countries for various purposes. And these purposes are adaptation, technology transfer, as well as the capacity building. So these are some of the funds which have been set up in order to address the problem of climate change. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the Special Climate Change Fund. The first statement is, it has been set up under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, as we have discussed, this particular statement is wrong because it has been set up under the Global Environment Facility. The second statement reads as, it provides finances to the developing countries for adaptation, technology transfer, and capacity building. And this particular statement, as we have discussed, is right. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. Similarly, based upon our discussion, a mains question for your practice would be, the climate change has emerged as one of the biggest health challenges in the 21st century. In this aspect, discuss the adverse impact of the climate change on health. Also highlight as to what strategy should the Indian government adopt to address these challenges. You can try writing answer to this question by looking at our video analysis. So having discussed all the three aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 13. The title of the article is RBI moves to ease the liquidity for the NBFC firms. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 3 economy under the subsection Indian economy and various issues. Before understanding this particular article, let us first look into the background. Now, as you know, the NBFCs in India are facing liquidity crunch, and this has become one of the reasons for the growing rift between the Reserve Bank of India and the government. This is because the government has so far been pressurizing the Reserve Bank of India to open a separate liquidity window for the NBFCs. However, the RBI has been reluctant to open a separate liquidity window for the NBFCs since it believes that a separate liquidity window may be misused. So, as an alternative to the separate liquidity window for the NBFCs, the RBI has now decided to relax the minimum holding period for the securitization of loans of the NBFCs. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand as to what do you mean by the securitization of loans, the concept of the minimum holding period, and how the relaxation in the minimum holding requirement would lead to increase in the liquidity for the NBFCs. Let us first understand the concept of securitization. Now, as you know, the NBFCs give loans for various sectors of the Indian economy. So, the concept of securitization allows these NBFCs to sell these assets to the investors. So, by selling these loans to the investors, the NBFCs would be able to reduce their credit risk which may arise on account of default on the loans. So, hence, by securitization, a certain part of credit risk from the NBFCs get transferred to the investors. So this is the main concept of securitization. Let us understand how this concept of securitization works by considering an example. Let's say a NBFC has given totally 10 different loans wherein the value of each loan is rupees 100. So under securitization, these 10 different individual loans are pooled together. Hence, by pooling these 10 assets, the total value of the pooled assets would be equal to rupees 1000. And these pooled assets are then sold to the investors. And as discussed, the securitization enables the redistribution of credit risk, wherein a certain part of the credit risk gets transferred from the NBFCs to that of the investors. So coming now to the RBI's guidelines with respect to the securitization of loans. Now RBI has stated that only those loans whose maturity period is greater than 5 years can undergo the securitization, which means that if the loan's maturity period is less than 5 years, then such loans cannot be sold by the NBFCs to the investors. The second guideline of the RBI is with respect to the minimum holding period of these loans. Now, minimum holding period here refers to the time period for which the NBFCs should hold the loans with themselves before selling these loans in a form of securitization to the investors. And earlier, the minimum holding period for securitization of loans was 1 year, and now according to recent changes the minimum holding period has got reduced to 6 months, which means that the period for which the NBFC should hold the loans before undertaking their securitization has got reduced from 1 year to 6 months. So this reduction in the minimum holding period would enable the NBFCs to sell their loans 6 months earlier as compared to the previous guidelines, and this would enable the NBFCs to increase their cash flows. So this particular RBI guideline would be able to address the liquidity concerns of the NBFCs to a certain extent by reducing the minimum holding period on the loans. So these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. So based upon the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the securitization of assets by the NBFCs. The first statement is, the securitization of assets involve pooling of assets to be sold to the investors. And as we have discussed, this particular statement is correct. Now the second statement reads as, it enables in redistribution of risk from the NBFCs to the investors. Even this particular statement is correct. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is C, that is both 1 and 2. With this, let us now move to the next article. The next article appears on page number 10. The title of the article is Jaitley Moots New Federal Bodies. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Government Policies and Interventions. As the title of the article here suggests that the Finance Minister Jaitley has put forward a proposal to set up councils for healthcare as well as agriculture on the lines that of the GST Council. So as part of this video analysis, let us understand as to what is the rationale behind the proposal of the Finance Minister to set up these new councils. Now, as you know, both agriculture as well as health are placed under the state list under the Indian Constitution, because of which most of the state governments across India are implementing a large number of schemes and programs in the field of agriculture as well as health. Apart from the state governments, even the central government has come out with centrally sponsored schemes in order to cater to both agriculture as well as health. For example, in the field of agriculture, some of the centrally sponsored schemes are Pradhan Mantri Krishi Vikas Yojana, Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, the National Food Security Mission, etc. And in the field of health, some of the centrally sponsored schemes are the National Health Mission, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, as well as the newly launched Ayushman Bharat scheme. However, one important problem with respect to implementation of schemes by both center as well as state is that it leads to unnecessary overlapping of the schemes. Apart from the overlapping, it also leads to lack of coordination between the state government agencies as well as the central government agencies, which means that in spite of the money spent by both center as well as state government, the money spent may not have the intended outcomes. So in this regard, the Finance Minister Jaitley has proposed a solution. The solution here is that the schemes implemented by the state as well as the center have to be merged. However, such merger of state schemes with the central schemes would go against the spirit of federalism, since the concerns of the state will not be taken into account. So in order to address the concerns of the state, the Finance Minister has proposed to create councils, and these councils will be set up on the lines of the GST Council, wherein these councils will be able to take into account the concerns of the states. So the main idea behind the Finance Minister proposal to create the councils is to improve the coordination and to avoid the overlapping of schemes in India. Now, apart from this, for your upcoming prelims exam, you would also be required to know the differences between the centrally sponsored scheme as well as the central sector scheme. So let us look at the differences between the two. Now the difference between the centrally sponsored schemes and the central sector schemes can be seen in terms of their funding, implementation, as well as on the subjects on which they are implemented. For example, the centrally sponsored schemes are funded by both center as well as state in a predetermined ratio. For example, if the expenditure ratio of a scheme is 60:40, it means that 60% of the funds shall be provided by the center and the remaining 40% of funds are provided by the state. However, the central sector schemes are completely funded by the central government. And when it comes to the implementation, the centrally sponsored schemes are implemented by the state machinery. On the other hand, the central sector schemes are implemented by the central agency, and normally the centrally sponsored schemes are implemented on the subjects under the state list as well as the concurrent list. On the other hand, the central sector schemes implement the subjects under the union list. And some examples of the centrally sponsored schemes include the MG Narega, the National Health Mission, the Swachh Bharat Mission, etc. However, the examples of the central sector schemes include the Bharat Net Project, Member of Parliament Local Area Development Scheme. So these are some of the aspects which you should know with respect to the differences between the centrally sponsored schemes and the central sector schemes. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to find the answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to government schemes. The first statement is, the centrally sponsored schemes are funded by both center and states but implemented by the center. Now this particular statement is wrong because as we have discussed, the centrally sponsored schemes are implemented by the state and not center. The second statement reads as, the central sector schemes are funded and implemented by the center. And as we have discussed, this particular statement is correct. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 8. The title of the article is Walking the Tightrope. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 International Relations under the subsection Bilateral Agreements Affecting India's Interest as well as Effect of Policies of the Developed Countries on India's Interest. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently US has decided to give a waiver on the Iranian sanctions, and this particular waiver has enabled India along with the other countries to continue to import oil from Iran for another 6 more months. So because of the decision of the US government to impose sanctions on Iran, India had to choose between US and Iran, which required fine balancing in India's foreign policy. Now this is because both US and Iran are important for India mainly from the perspective of both economics as well as geopolitics. In this regard, this particular article highlights the importance of US and Iran for India's foreign policy. So as part of this video analysis, let us understand the importance of these two countries for India's foreign policy. Now coming to Indo-US relationship, now USA is considered to be India's main strategic partner, and this strategic nature of relationship between India and US can be seen in the fact that there is convergence in the interests of these two countries on number of global issues. For example, both these countries have convergence of interest in dealing with China as well as the Afghan problem. Further, as seen recently, the convergence of these two countries has also been increasing in the Indo-Pacific region. And apart from this convergence on number of issues, USA has emerged as one of the major defense exporter for India. Further, the economic relationship between the two countries is growing steadily as evident in the growing trade between the two countries, wherein US has emerged as among the top 3 trading partners for India. Apart from that, the signing of the Nuclear Energy Cooperation Agreement has further enriched strategic relationship between the two countries. Further, this particular article makes a special mention of the growing energy relationship between the two countries. Now recently in April 2018, US and India signed the Strategic Energy Partnership Agreement, and this particular agreement is set to enhance the energy cooperation between the two countries. And according to US, this energy cooperation is set to emerge as a central piece in the bilateral relationship between the two countries. So through the signing of this particular agreement, the US believes that it can serve as a key supplier of oil to India. However, this particular article has raised concerns with respect to US belief that emerge as a key supplier of oil to India by replacing Iran. This is because US has ignored the multidimensional and strategic nature of relationship between India and Iran, which means to say that the relationship between India and Iran is just not determined by only oil. Rather, the relationship between India and Iran is much more meaningful and it is multidimensional and strategic in nature. And this multidimensional and strategic nature of relationship between India and Iran can be seen in the fact that both these countries share the same regional interest in Central Asia, West Asia, as well as Afghanistan. For example, both India and Iran are seeking to expand their cooperation with the Central Asian countries. Further, both India and Iran share the same security concerns arising from Afghanistan. And the shared regional interest between India and Iran is evident in the fact that both these countries are the signatories to the International North-South Transport Corridor. Further, the construction of Chabahar port by India in Iran has given a further strategic fillip to this particular relationship. Hence, in this regard, the article concludes by saying that so far India has been able to maintain a fine balance in its foreign policy towards US and Iran, and it would continue to do so even in future as well. So these are some of the aspects which you should know with respect to this particular article. Let us look at one of the UPSC mains question asked in 2018 related to this particular topic. The question was, in what ways would the ongoing US-Iran nuclear pact controversy affect the national interests of India? How should India respond to this particular situation? Similarly, based upon the discussion which we had so far, a mains question for your practice would be, India shares multi-dimensional and strategic relationship with both US and Iran. Hence, in the light of recent differences between the two countries, India would be required to finally balance its relationship with both the countries discussed. Now you can try writing answer to this question by going to the video analysis. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears as a lead article on page number 8. The title of the article is A Case for a Progressive International. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 2 under the subsection Social Justice. Now this particular article basically highlights that the world as such is facing two major problems, and these problems being the decline in the democracy and increase in the transnational issues. So in order to combat these problems, this article highlights that there is a need for international progressive movement, and one example of this international progressive movement which has been given in this article is the Democracy in Europe movement. It is to be noted that this particular movement was started in Greece in response to the Greek economic crisis. Further, the article also highlights that such international progressive movements have a lot of relevance for India, since the international progressive movement would enable India to combat these problems. In this aspect, let us understand about the international progressive movement and its relevance for India. Now, this particular article highlights that there has been increase in the number of the transnational issues which are affecting the interests of the citizens across the world. And one example of such a transnational issue which has been mentioned in the article is that of Greece. Now, after the debt crisis in Greece, the International Monetary Fund had imposed the Structural Adjustment Program on Greece. And this particular Structural Adjustment Program required the government of Greece to cut down on its expenditure, and this led to the increase in the unemployment in Greece. Further, it is to be noted that this structural adjustment program was imposed on the Greece against the will of the people. So one can clearly see here the will of the International Monetary Fund prevailed upon the will of the people in Greece. Further, another example of this transnational issue which can be seen in India is with respect to the compulsory licensing provided by the Indian Parliament under the Patents Act. It is to be noted here that under the compulsory licensing, if the Indian government is of an opinion that a patented drug is costly and unaffordable to the poor man, then the Indian government can issue license to a domestic pharma company to manufacture the patented drug and sell it to the people at a lower price. For example, the Indian government had recently issued the compulsory licensing for the Nexava drug, which was a patented cancer drug manufactured by the pharma company known as Bayer. The government was of an opinion that the Nexavar was very costly and unaffordable to the poor people. Hence, accordingly, the government issued the compulsory licensing to a domestic pharma company known as the Natco Pharma to manufacture the Nexavar and sell it to the people at a lower price. However, this particular article has highlighted that this compulsory licensing issued by the Indian government has come under immense pressure by the pharma lobbies in USA, wherein US has argued that the compulsory licensing goes against the spirit of the TRIPS agreement provided under the WTO. So this particular issue clearly highlights that the profit motive of the patented drug makers has gone against the basic human requirement of access to medicines. So these two examples here clearly indicate that it has become extremely difficult for the countries across the world to address these transnational issues. So in this regard, this particular article suggests that there has to be a collaborative and collective efforts by the countries across the world to solve these transnational issues. And this can be done through an international progressive movement. And this international progressive movement must be aimed to promote the social justice and fundamental rights of the people across the world. It should address the global inequality both in terms of the economic power as well as the political power. This becomes important because sometimes the developed countries impose their will upon the developing and poor countries. Hence, in this regard, the international progressive movement must also address the global inequality in terms of political power. And lastly, this particular movement must have a vision of shared prosperity. And one such example of the international progressive movement is the Democracy in Europe movement, which was launched in Greece in response to the structural adjustment program imposed by the IMF. Finally, this particular article concludes by saying that there is a need to launch such movements even in India as well, because this will help India to solve various transnational issues such as the global warming, climate change, agrarian crisis, etc. So these are some of the aspects of the article which one must know. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is ISRO puts the sharp eye into the orbit. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the launch of country's first hyperspectral imaging satellite by ISRO. This particular article has been comprehensively been covered in our DNS dated 28th of November 2018. So you can go through this particular video to know all the aspects related to the HysIs satellite. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.